Hello and welcome to the second video in the Getting Started with SQL series. In this video, we are going to be carrying on with our example of the web store that we were working on and expanding it out to add some columns to the products table. We're going to update the products table with some data and then delete some data in that table as well. To do so, I am going to be creating a new script just so I'm keeping things separate for the video purposes. And to do that, I'm going to right click on Web Store, go to SQL Editor and click New SQL Script. If you would like to carry on from where we left off, if you're just watching the videos one after the other, feel free just to carry on below. There's no need to create a new script if you would like. We should probably get into, first of all, just a bit of the background into what keywords we're going to be using to do this. So we've got, again, our DDL, DML, data definition and data manipulation languages, and we are going to be using the alter statement. And if you remember, DDL is changing the structure of the database and how the tables are structured, and DML is changing what's inside the tables and how the contents in those tables look, so the data itself. We are manipulating the data rather than defining the structure of the data. The alter statement is going to be used to add columns and any constraints that go on there as well. And the manipulation language, we're going to be using the update command, which is the updating data, and the delete command. One of the things that I find quite easy with SQL to fall into the habit of, and probably good habit as well, if you're working with SQL on a regular basis, is I typically use the correct keyword to explain what word I would need. I appreciate if you're new to SQL in general, actually considering how you would change a table, you might use the word change instead, whereas I've specifically used the word alter. But if you can try to get these sorts of terms, don't worry about all of them, but these sorts of terms when you're talking about working with databases into your mind, it will make the queries easier to write. So create is creating a table, creating a stored procedure, creating other things. Alter is altering the structure. If you are, and using this incorrectly on purpose, if you are altering the data, you are updating the data. Hopefully that makes sense, but anyways. So I'll come over to my new script that I've created here. Again, you can see we're connected to Web Store and we are in script 6. And let's go ahead and just have a look at where we are with our table. So I'm going to Control Enter on this. And there we go. We've got our 1, 2, 3 iPhone, calculator and pen. So this is a web store example and this is our products table. A products table is all well and good, but we should probably have some prices for them. And in reality, if you were designing these tables, if you were designing this database, you would go through a full design ideation process where you understand the structure. Again, this is a tutorial. We're just working through it step by step to understand the commands. But thinking ahead just a little bit, if we were to add one column for price and we will use some sort of a number column to do so, we then may well need to store some sort of a currency as well. I'm based in the UK, obviously, if you can't tell from my accent. So I'm going to be using British pounds, GBP, but feel free to experiment, use other currencies if you would like, and their currency codes, as you would denote them. There will be no change in how this works. You just might have to change some of the future queries that we do. So let's go ahead and keep clicking on that. Come back to our alphabetical list of documents, and I'm going to go into number 5 right at the top, alter table, because first of all, before we can update these values, we need to actually make sure the columns are in place. And the first column we're going to add is a price column. So following through this, hopefully by now, rather familiar format, we are going to alter table name, and we are going to add column definition. So we can come into here, which is column name, type name, and any constraints. And we can just do that straight out, I think, and shot it. So press the right key. Alter table products, add column name, price, and then the type name. Before I did talk about these as the data types within SQL. I believe I misspoke slightly. You can't actually create a null column type. These are the column types that you would create, either text, numeric, integer, real, or blob. As far as I understand it, numeric is basically trying to decide at runtime, as you're inserting data, whether it should be storing a number as an integer or a real. Please correct me if I'm wrong in the comments, someone who knows more than me. In general, again, for storing currency values, we would never want to use a real. We would probably be storing an integer. Too much for the scope of this video, and to keep things nice and simple, I'm just going to go with numeric for today. So I was going to copy that, but let's just go write it out up here, numeric. Come back to my alter table command. So we're out of here. We're not going to put any constraints on there. We're out of constraints. We can then put a check clause on there. I'm going to skip that for now, but we can just go all of the, sorry, column definition here. We're not even doing the constraint. Column definition and all the way to the end. Fantastic. Let's go ahead, highlight that column and run it. And then if I come up to this statement again, hopefully you have realized that we won't see the price column yet. And that is for good reason, because we have actually, and as you should, specified these columns by name. Now, to get the price column in there, all we need to do is add price to these here. You'll notice as well, this is showing a bit of an error here. If you're working in dbeaver rather than the online version I pointed to last time, you can just go ahead and on any of this hierarchy, right click and refresh, and that error will go away. It just updates the IDE's or the database management software's understanding of what your database looks like. So if I go ahead and run this, we have price null. I also, in the last video, tried to give a bit of an explanation around what null was, null being nothing, as the name suggests. I think, in retrospect, a numeric column is actually a better column to do this explanation in. And the reason for that is a blank string, if you think about fetching some data back, let's say you wanted to enter a message in, and you had an application that was fetching back a message from the database. If you entered a blank string and returned that message back from the database, it would be blank. If you entered a null, the message field, you may well hide it in the logic, but it could still return blank as well, depending on how you wrote the application. However, for number values, this is a lot more important. And this is because if you think about the zero value, if you like, for a number, that would be zero. But we wouldn't be wanting to set a price to zero, because otherwise we'd be selling our iPhones, calculators and pens for nothing. So actually a null is a very good number to set this to, because later on we can see any values which have not had the price set, as opposed to having a zero value in there. So the next column we're going to add is the currency column, and that is going to be quite similar as well. We are just going to come along and copy and paste this for now. So I've got this first piece here, and I'm going to add column currency, and the best type for this is going to be text, because I am going to be storing, for example, a value that looks like this, or if you were in America, you could do USD, etc., etc. I know that these values are also all going to be, most of them will come on some exceptions later on, but most of them are going to be GBP anyway. And actually, as I'm writing my insert statements, my update statements, if I know the default is GBP, I don't need to worry about setting GBP for anything else. So what I can do is I can alter table products, add column name, type name. So we've got all of that so far. But then we can come along and we can add a column constraint. And if we open that up, and what we can do is we can set, if you look in here, a default value. So we can specify a default value for this. So let's go ahead and set this to default GBP, and I hope that is going to work. Yes. Let's keep that there for historic purposes. Refresh our columns again on the right hand side. And again, if you remember, we would need to add, if we ran this, currency won't come up until we've added it in. Now, another shortcut we can do rather than adding currency into this list of fields is, for the purposes of this tutorial demonstration, what we can actually do is replace all of these column names with a single star. Production applications, avoid this where you can. Scripts, I try to avoid this where I can. If you're just doing some exploration, star is significantly easier to use. It just means every column, so makes things nice and easy. If I run this, you will now see currency has come along. You'll also notice that the currency by default is set to GBP. It's not to say we can't set it to anything else. We haven't specified any checks or constraints or anything, but what we have done is we've said by default we want it to be British pounds. So we've got our ID, we've got our name, and we've added our columns, price and currency. How are we going to update this price? Back to here very briefly. We are now working with data, so we're working in the DML, and we are going to use the update statement. So back to an alphabetical list of documents and search for update. So a fairly simple one here. Update table name set column name equals value. And you can specify multiple with commas if you would like, but we can look at that later on. So let's go ahead and update table name products, set price equals, and let's do the iPhone first. We'll go with 10.99, and just to demonstrate something, I will put two zero value decimal places, and then we're going to say, if we were to run this statement, I believe it would actually error, but I'm not going to run it just in case. If we were to run this statement, we haven't isolated iPhone. All we've done is we've said update product set price equal to 10.99, and that would set every single row to 10.99. Now, if you remember from our last query, we were able to isolate specific rows to say where ID is greater than, is less than, or is equal to name a few. So we can actually use a where clause on the end of this statement to say where. We can just use the ID rather than having to type out iPhone. ID equals 1. So hopefully this statement makes sense. Update products, set price equals 10.99, where ID equals 1. Control Enter, updated rows 1, and let's have a look at it. As expected, we've got the iPhone set to 10.99. We are missing the decimal places though, and this again comes back to that point I was making about the numeric column type making its sort of own decision about how it's going to store that number. The two zeros at the end weren't adding any value to this. We've just entered what's effectively a round number, which doesn't need any decimal places, so it's just going to store that 10.99 as it is. But if we go ahead and we update ID number 2, and we're not going to set that, that would be a very expensive calculator. Let's say that's going to be 24.99. And run that. you'll see what this has actually done is it's stored the decimal places. Quite useful. Again, we've retained the GBP, we've retained all the other columns, we have just set this one column to this value. So let's go ahead and update the pen to 195. And there we go. We've got our 3 products in the table with a price against them. Coming back to what we were focusing on today, we've added columns to the products table. We've updated some data in that table. Now we're going to delete some data from the table as well. So before we do that, let's quickly refer back to the handy dandy little diagram we've got over here. We're going to be using the delete keyword. Search back in the alphabetical list of documents for delete. And this, by far the simplest diagram we've come across yet. Delete from table name, where, expression. However, I kind of like these rows as they are for now. We want to keep these 3 rows. So let's add, before we start deleting things, let's add another product in. And I am going to insert into products. And if you remember, we don't have to specify the ID. We can specify the name. We will need to specify the price. And we don't need to specify the currency because that has this default value as well. So then we're going to say values. And let's add a toaster for $19.99. Run that. Double check. Fantastic. Let's just say, for sake of argument, we wanted to add another toaster, but where the price was in US dollars, for example. How would we do that? And if you want to pause the video and give it a try, feel free to do so. I will proceed myself now though. I'm going to come up here and we just want to make sure we are also inserting the currency. We can use the same statement. I'll copy and paste it just so you can see the difference very clearly. I'm going to go name, price, currency, and let's say that's $24.99, and let's put that as USD. Let's see how that looks. So no error, it inserted absolutely fine. And when we have a look at this table, you'll see we have overridden that default of GBP to be USD. And actually, because we didn't specify a not null constraint on here, there's nothing stopping this. The default is going to be GBP, but there's nothing stopping it from being null. If I were to run this, that would go in absolutely fine. And you see we've got a value of null. However, we now have a problem. We've inserted this value. We've got our toaster and our 2 currencies, but we don't want this last one. So let's go ahead and look at how we would delete that. And there's a number of ways we can do so. The first one is going to be using the ID, which is probably the safest way. And we can follow along with this flowchart. So delete from products, if I can spell, where, and then the expression is going to be ID equals 6. And for some reason, that is giving me an error, invalid column reference. That should be fine. Yeah, was fine. We run our select star again. You will notice that ID number 6 has gone. What I'm going to do is I'm going to insert this again just a couple more times. Let's have a look at this table again. See, we've now got 2 toasters with null currency. And this, in all honesty, if you are manually inserting things into the database, it can happen. You just accidentally insert things multiple times and you shouldn't have done. Perhaps you're cleaning some data for some data analysis and you want to remove everything. Now we could go through and we could run this statement for 7 and for 8, or we could isolate it by name. We couldn't really isolate it by price because you'll notice our toaster is $24.99 USD, and actually if we said where price equals $24.99, we would also be removing this record with an ID of 5. But what we can do is we know we want to remove every instance where the currency is null. So what we can do is say where currency is null. And you'll notice I've used is rather than equals. When you are looking for is, or when something is or isn't null, you have to say is or is not null. And I will have to be very careful about removing that not, because if I said delete from products where currency is not null, it would actually remove all of these records that we want to keep. So now we're going to delete from products where currency is null. Updated rows 2, and they're gone. I've just realised as well, if we had done it using the toaster name, we'd have also removed these records, so we couldn't have used toaster either. We would either have to have run it for the IDs 7 and 8, or the currency, where we could do it in one. Hopefully that is enough to get you thinking about what other columns you'd like to add to this table, what other products you'd like to add to this table. Don't worry about if your IDs aren't matching up. You'll notice as I'm inserting more values, these no longer remain sequential. What these are doing is ID 6, 7 and 8 have already been taken, and although we've deleted them, what you've got to remember is if I insert another one, run that, we now have 9 and 10. If I removed where ID equals 10, 9, rather than making the database have to think about, actually I've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Next one I can use is 6. In the background, what the sequence is just doing is it's just keeping track of the latest number that it's insert and saying, give me the next one. So the next one to go in would be 11. And there we go, there's 11. But we can also very easily remove these just by using where currency is null again. Fantastic. So yeah, again, I hope this is enough to get you thinking about how you could be expanding this out a little bit more. In the next video, we will dive further into SQL using more statements, more of the keywords that are available in SQLite. And yes, any questions, please drop them below. Otherwise, I will speak with you again in the next installment of this series. Thank you for watching.